Hello and welcome to our video on Reconstruction, Reintegration, Racism, and Industrialization. This is really part one because we're just going to talk about reintegration and racism. Industrialization will be covered at a later date. So we're going to look at Reconstruction, what Reconstruction was, what happened, the problems with it, and what it means for us today. So after the Civil War, the South was pretty much destroyed. It needed to be rebuilt. The Civil War, as we know, ended on April 9th, 1865. But in December of 1863, so even before the war ended, Lincoln had started to reformulate a Reconstruction plan. He called it the 10% Plan, and it offered a general amnesty to all white Southerners with the temporary exception of Confederate high military officers. So as soon as 10% of the number of 1860 voters in any state, once 10% took a loyalty oath, they could then set up a state government that was part of the United States. They had to accept a ban on slavery in order to be readmitted. However, Lincoln was shot on April 14th and he died on the 15th. So we don't actually know how that would have turned out because Vice President Andrew Johnson instead became president after Lincoln was shot. So the task of pursuing Reconstruction fell to Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson. He was of Tennessee. He wasn't really well suited pretty much at all for the presidency. But Johnson revealed his Reconstruction plan very soon after he took office, and like Lincoln, he did offer some form of amnesty to Southerners who took an oath of allegiance. However, there were a couple of changes. Wealthy rebels, so like people who were worth more than $20,000, would have to apply directly to the president for a pardon. So instead of just being, 10% of the population, the wealthy have to write directly to the president in order to be pardoned. And then in order to win readmission into the Union, the former Confederate state citizen, all their citizens had to revoke their secession ordinance, which we know about the secession ordinances. Those were like the statements of secession. They had to revoke those. They had to abolish slavery, and they had to ratify the 13th Amendment. They also had to pay war debts. Johnson, when he was thinking about this, he was really envisioning a quick, easy reconciliation between the North and the South, but he really demonstrated no actual concern for free black men or women. So the 13th Amendment needed to be ratified in order for people to in order for states to be brought back into the Union. The 13th Amendment has two primary clauses. The first one is the most important. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or place any subject to their jurisdiction. The second one is Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So the first part means that slavery isn't legal except for within the context of convicts. So people who have been arrested and charged with a crime can be convicted and go to prison and then can be used for labor. So laborers from prisons, that's acceptable, but slavery in name is not. The second thing is that Congress, this is a federal law, so Congress has the right to enforce it. It isn't just done by states, which was kind of how it was done at the time. So that's the 13th Amendment. My question to you, though, is right up front, what problems might you see with the 13th Amendment? So, events in the South drove Northern opinion in the public opinion in very radical directions. So, because the delegates in the Southern state constitutional conventions were really reluctant to abolish slavery. They were reluctant to renounce slavery. They did not at all want to grant suffrage to freedmen. And many states even elected prominent ex-Confederates to represent them in Congress. But the worst thing for the Northerners was what happened in the South, and that was the passing of laws that is known as the Black Codes. These were designed to give whites almost complete control over former slaves. The codes authorized local white officials to apprehend unemployed blacks, to fine them from vagrancy, to hire them out to private employers to satisfy these fines. So do you see already kind of where the 13th Amendment might have been a problem? The codes also forbade blacks to own or lease farms or to take any jobs other than as plantation workers or as domestic servants. Finally, many freedmen became tenants of white landowners, which means that they worked their own plots and paid their landlords a fixed rent or a share of the crop, and they became what is known as sharecroppers or tenant farming. To many Northerners and to most African Americans, the Black Codes really represented a return to slavery in all ways except by name. There were laws that were passed to keep black people from voting. Poll taxes was a popular one, saying that former slaves had to pay a pretty hefty tax in order to vote. The other one is a little bit more sinister, the grandfather clause, saying that a person can only vote if their grandfather voted. So these things kept black people from voting, and laws were passed so that black people would go to jail, would go to prison, and be convicted. So I'm sure you're starting to put this together about how all of this is fairly problematic and how it relates to the present. And if you don't, we'll talk about it in class. This is a map of sharecroppers and how many sharecroppers there were in the South. As you can see, there are big plots of land that had a lot of sharecropped farms. And so that means that they basically had black workers, white landowners, and these black workers had to pay to live on the land. So soon after, during Reconstruction, in 1866, so a year after the Civil War ended, a group of white Southerners created the Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK. We talk about the KKK a lot, I don't know, sort of vaguely, but I don't know, it means something very specific. The KKK was a secret society. They were underground, and they were opposed to civil rights, particularly the right for black people to vote. It didn't necessarily start with lynching, though it did go there. Violence and intimidation were the tactics of choice. But the KKK were kind of ashamed. They didn't want other people to know who they were, so they wore these white robes and hoods to hide these identities. And these people were often very powerful white people with influence and money. So these people are white, wealthy, powerful Southerners that have a say in what goes on in the government. So there were many atrocities committed on African Americans that made it pretty clear that the existing Southern state governments were failing to protect the freedmen and protect their legal rights. And part of that was done by the KKK. So the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed after the 13th. The 14th Amendment said that that all people born or naturalized within the United States were granted citizenship automatically, except for American Indians, not American citizens, United States citizens. It also said that state governments could not, quote, deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So that basically means that you can't, like, kill somebody. The state government can't, like, kill somebody or take somebody's property or incarcerate them without first having a trial, which is still problematic, but we'll talk about it. So the 14th Amendment kind of penalized states for reducing their representation in Congress if they were denying suffrage to any male inhabitants. It also prohibited former members of Congress or other former federal officials who had aided the Confederacy from holding any state or federal office, unless that Congress had voted to pardon them. So it eventually gave, like, the states the power over citizens' rights. The 15th Amendment was passed with the Republican effort to make equal rights for blacks the law. Republican means Democrat, as we talk about it today. So, as we talked about before, Republican in this setting means liberal. Democrat means conservative. Republicans are typically in the North. Democrats are typically in the South. Right. So the 15th Amendment, it was ratified in 1870, and the amendment prohibited any state from denying citizens the right to vote because of race or color or previous condition of servitude. So it was kind of aimed at, like, that grandfather clause or the poll tax, even though, like, it didn't really matter. But the secondary aim of the amendment was to give black people in northern states, sort of a good reason to go to the polls, to say, like, yeah, you're really not going to be discriminated against at the polls, so go. However, the 15th Amendment really outraged white women. White women were pissed about this because they were like, really? So black people get the right to vote, but your white women, your wives, your daughters can't vote? And this is exactly how they thought. It was racially driven. This was a racial issue. So when we talk later about women's suffrage and the waves of feminism that came later, and when we talk today about intersectional feminism and what that means and why race is important, like intersectional feminism and race is important for this exact issue, because historically white women have sort of, like, taken the things that happen that are good for black people and turned it against them to say, hey, white women should have this because we're white like you. It is racially driven. It's ridiculous. I don't know how else to say it. We can talk about it more in class. But that's the general gist. Like, white women were really, really mad. They used the 15th Amendment to argue for voting rights against black people. Okay, now that I've sort of established that. Eventually, the 15th Amendment gave states the right to grant voting rights. So it sort of digressed from the congressional thing to, state level. So southern states could really easily disenfranchise black people for, quote, non-racial issues. So, like, a lack of education, a lack of property, the poll tax, right? Things like that. This is a really interesting case, and it's not something that we necessarily have to talk about, but I think it really is interesting. Myra Bradwell in 1873 went to court because she had been denied the right to practice law in Illinois. She was a female attorney, been denied the right to practice law. She argued that in the 14th Amendment, it said that she should be able to practice law because state governments could not deprive any person of life, liberty, property, right? So she should be able to practice law. But then she said that the state had sort of abridged or skipped over some of her privileges and immunities as a citizen. So she's a citizen, and per the 14th Amendment, the state can't take those things away from her. But they did. She went to court. She lost. The Supreme Court totally rejected it. They said that women are traditionally in the home, and that's where they should be. So therefore, Myra Bradwell cannot practice law. So we've got a long history of this, like talking about traditionalism. Women believe in the home, belong in the home, shouldn't be in the workforce, etc. And that's going to become really important when we move into the 1920s. As sort of a result of all of the disenfranchisement violence that was going on in the South, the North pushed through the Civil Rights Act of 1875. They said that it was a crime for any individual to deny full and equal use of public spaces. That basically means that segregation is illegal. They the Civil Rights Act prohibited discrimination in jury selection so that black people who were in court couldn't be tried by an all-white jury that was racist. Not that that worked, but whatever. However, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was not enforceable at all. Like, it was just sort of words on a paper, nobody could enforce it, didn't work very well. And in 1883, it was declared unconstitutional. So, the 14th Amendment gave Congress the power to outlaw discrimination, but not by private individuals. That was the ruling, that it was Congress that outlawed discriminations, like, for the state. So the state can't discriminate, but private individuals can. They also said during this case in 1883 that black people must no longer be, quote, the special favorites of the laws. This is our last slide, and it's about Jim Crow laws and Plessy versus Ferguson. So segregation policies started in 1881, and by segregation policies I mean formal written laws that it creates a legal separation of blacks and whites in public spaces. 1881. Jim Crow laws are the name of the laws that enforce segregation. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation was indeed legal in the case Plessy versus Ferguson. They said, quote, separate but equal facilities to be provided for black people. I'm sure you've heard that term, separate but equal. We'll talk about that more in class, what that actually means. But here are some examples of Jim Crow laws. Intermarriage. And I'm going to be quoting from actual Jim Crow law codes. So, intermarriage. The marriage of a person of Caucasian blood with a Negro, Mongolian, Malay, or Hindu shall be null and void. This is in Arizona. Education. The schools for white children and the schools for Negro children shall be conducted separately. Florida. Burial. The officer in charge shall not bury or allow to be buried any colored persons upon the ground set apart or used for the burial of white persons. This is in Georgia. Parks. It shall be unlawful for colored people to frequent any park owned or maintained by the city for the benefit, use, and enjoyment of white persons, and unlawful for any white person to frequent any park owned or maintained by the city for the use and benefit of colored persons, also in Georgia. The promotion of equality. Now get this one. Any person who shall be guilty of printing, publishing, or circulated printed, typewritten, or written matter urging or presenting for public acceptance or general information, arguments, or suggestions in favor of social equality or of intermarriage between the whites and Negroes shall be guilty of a misdemeanor and subject to a fine not exceeding $500 or imprisonment not exceeding 6 months or both. Mississippi. Textbooks. Books shall not be interchangeable between the white and colored schools, but shall continue to be used by the race first using them. That's in North Carolina. We're going to talk about that one. Why would they ban textbooks? Why would they segregate textbooks? We'll get there. Lastly, militia. The white and colored militia shall be separately enrolled and shall never be compelled to serve in the same organization. No organization of colored troops shall be permitted where white troops are available, and while whites are permitted to be organized, colored troops shall be under the command of white officers. This is in North Carolina. So these are just a couple of examples of Jim Crow laws. There are hundreds and hundreds of Jim Crow laws. We'll talk about more of them in class. But the basic gist is that that segregation is legal, and it's a good thing, and that's what they were thinking. Segregation is legal, and blacks can't be the favorite anymore. This is the argument. We'll talk about what that means, the merits, and what that means for us right now in class. Thank you.